My name is David Benkoff, and I'm going to be presenting to you a session on Philip Roth 101. So I am not a literature guy by training. I'm a historian, but I'm a historian of American Judaism. And of all the people who write about American Judaism, the one that I think is the most interesting is not a historian. He's a novelist, and that's Philip Roth. I thought I would devise a LImmud session in which we could explore American Judaism through the lens of this very important Jewish writer who we lost in May. And I imagine a lot of you heard about his death, and a lot of people were talking about him, and a lot of people wondered what the story is. But when I started deciding to read more Roth, I had read a couple of books, but when I started deciding to read more Roth, I started looking around to pick books to read beyond Goodbye Columbus and Portrait of Complaint and The Plot Against America, all of which I had read. I wanted to see what to read next. It was very difficult for me to find clear explanations of what each Roth book was. A lot of them were very intimidating. So, for example, here is the back cover of an excellent novel called The Counterlife, which is about two brothers. It's one of his most Jewish books. It's about Israel. It's about American Jewish identity. It's about intermarriage. It's about England versus the United States. And on the back cover here, here's how it's described. In this, Roth's most radical work of fiction, people act out their dreams of renewal and escape, some even willing to risk their lives to alter their destinies. What the hell does that mean? There's no content here. And I don't know who they thought was going to buy it based on this very, very vague description. Then there's something called the American Trilogy, which are 3 books that are somehow a trilogy, but they're not. They just happen to be 3 books set in 3 different eras. One is during Vietnam, one is during the McCarthy era, and one is during the Clinton political correct era. But they don't really have anything to do with each other other than that they're American. But I heard them and I thought, oh, I don't want to start a trilogy. I thought like Lord of the Rings trilogy or something. I don't want to start a trilogy. But I could have read them and they're really good.
Are they bound together?
No.
Okay.
They're just separate books. I could have, and I actually did the first book I read in this series of books that I read, and I have read half of his corpus, read or reread, since his death in May. I've read about 4,000 pages since his passing. First one I started with was The Human Stain, which is a great book, and it completely stands on its own. But anyway, so The Human Stain, awesome book, but I've never thought, and I still don't, that I have to read I Married a Communist or American Pastoral in order to understand it. Anyway, so what I've done for you, and this isn't really going to be used in this session, but I've made you a booklet that has a description of and a highlight from a lot of Philip Roth works. Please.
These by chance in the order you've recommended for reading them?
No, but then you've got this sheet, which gives, and we'll talk about this later, this tells you where I think you should start, and what you should do next, and what you should do next. So if that's what you came here looking for, you got it.
Okay.
Let's talk about what makes Philip Roth so great. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is that his prose is delicious. He's got a way of writing that it makes you stop stunned, because he's just got such an ear for the English language, and sometimes an eye. Here's a quote from The Plot Against America. This is set in 1940s America as Charles Lindbergh becomes president of the United States and begins an anti-Semitic campaign as the United States allies itself with Adolf Hitler. Their being Jews didn't issue from the rabbinate or the synagogue or from their formal religious practices, though over the years, largely for the sake of living parents who came once a week to visit and eat, several of the households, ours among them, were kosher. Their being Jews didn't even issue from on high. To be sure, every Friday at sundown, when my mother ritually and touchingly, with the devotional delicacy she'd absorbed as a child from watching her own mother, lit the Sabbath candles, she invoked the Almighty by his Hebrew title, but otherwise no one ever made mention of Adonai. These were Jews who needed no large terms of reference, no profession of faith or doctrinal creed in order to be Jews. And they certainly needed no other language. They had one, their native tongue, whose vernacular expressiveness they wielded effortlessly. And whether at the card table or making a sales pitch, with the easygoing command of the indigenous population. Neither was their being Jews a mishap or a misfortune or an achievement to be proud of. What they were was what they couldn't get rid of, what they couldn't even begin to want to get rid of. Their being Jews issued from their being themselves, as did their being American. It was as it was, in the nature of things, as fundamental as having arteries and veins, and they never manifested the slightest desire to change it or deny it, regardless of the consequences. So I just think it's lean prose, it's muscular prose, and it touches my experience as an American Jew. It touches my experience as an American, and it touches my experiences as a Jew, and I just love. I love reading Roth. The next thing I want to talk to you about is the fact that Roth asks great questions. So I'm going to give you some examples of the questions that he asks. And this one is from my favorite Roth work, which is a short story called The Conversion of the Jews. If you look at your beginner's guide and checklist, I've given you 3 ways to read Conversion of the Jews.
Wait, not Goodbye Columbus.
It's one of the short stories collected.
Okay.
There are 5 short stories collected. Okay. Without having to buy Goodbye Columbus in 5 short stories, it's online. You can read it at tinyurl.com/Philip Roth 101A. You can watch me teach it. That's the one I recommend. At Philip Roth 101, tinyurl.com/Roth 101B. Or you can hear it read aloud by Elliot Gould at 101C. Or you can do more than one. But this is my favorite Philip Roth work. It's been for a long time. I have read the book at least 100 times.
Oh.
I read the short story. It's about 40 pages. I've read it at least 100 times. I've taught it at least 10 times. And every time I find something new. But Ozzie Friedman is a boy in Hebrew school. And he has questions that the rabbi can't or won't answer. He asks, why when, if the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal, how could the Jews be the chosen people? He asks, how come his mother and his grandmother, in looking over the list of the victims of an airplane accident at LaGuardia, how come they were counting the Jewish names? And the rabbi said, well, we have cultural unity. And he's a 12-year-old boy. He couldn't express his feelings. So he stood up and shouted, I wish all 57 were Jews. Right? Because he couldn't express. And then he says this, Rabbi, if God can do anything, why can't a woman have a baby without intercourse? Well, the rabbis were saying that, look, Jesus was historical, God doesn't make babies without intercourse. And he wants to know, well, couldn't he? And the rabbi couldn't answer his question. The answer is, of course God can. If God can make the earth, then he can, but they weren't listening to him. So this is a short story about how younger Jews are asking questions and older Jews aren't answering. Then there are some questions that he answers in his novels. For example, what if Anne Frank survived the Holocaust? That's in The Ghostwriter. I'm not going to say anything more other than she's a ghostwriter. What if we forgot remembering? There's a character in The Counterlife who hijacks an El Al flight to promote his philosophy of forgetting remembering, with the idea that the Gentiles will accept us if we stop beating up on them for having persecuted us. And this was actually in 1988, and he said, we've had 40 years in the desert, 1948, 1988, and it's time to finally live on our own and stop making Judaism be about the Holocaust. Now, it's kind of a silly idea, but it's a good question. Then, wouldn't the Jews be safer in their homes in Near Eastern Europe than in the dangerous Middle East? In a book called Operation Shylock, a bizarre but interesting book, There's a character who has a philosophy. Character, by the way, is named Philip Roth. Philip Roth meets somebody who's pretending to be him. And the other Philip Roth has this philosophy called diasporism, that you negotiate with Lech Walesa and other Eastern European leaders that the Ashkenazi Jews will move back to Poland and Russia, which is their homes, and they'll be safe. Again, a nutty idea, but it's an interesting idea, and only Philip Roth gets to ask it. And then we have a plot against America, which I mentioned, which is, what if Charles Lindbergh defeated FDR in 1940 and began persecuting the Jews? This is a chilling work. One of the things I really like about Philip Roth, and this is especially true of The Conversion of the Jews, a short story I hope you'll read, is, while the works are deep, and there are a ton of dissertations about Philip Roth, he's got a lot of symbolism that is totally at the surface. You don't have to be a literary scholar, you don't have to know Kafka or literary criticism in order to notice he's got lots of really fun symbolism. And one of the places that I like his symbolism is in the names of his characters. Goodbye Columbus, the main character, which you see from the movie about Goodbye Columbus, you see him in a library. His name is Klugman. Klug in Yiddish or German is
Smart.
Smart or clever, right? He's a Klug man. Then, this one, Ozzie Friedman, is the young man who wants the rabbi to answer his questions, but he doesn't. He wants to be freed. And the rabbi is named Rabbi Binder. Now, I think on the 7th or 8th time that I taught this short story, I was talking about all the symbols of the story and how it's kind of like an ongoing conflict between Jews all the way back to biblical times with the binding of Isaac. And somebody said, the guy's name is Binder. I had read this short story 100 times. I'm not exaggerating, and I never noticed that. But it's there. Once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Then Sheldon Grossbart is a main character in a short story called The Defender of the Faith, tinyurl.com, Philip Roth 101D, that he is a private in the U.S. Army right at the end of World War II, and he is pushing all the buttons of his Jewish sergeant, saying, let me have special privileges, because, hey, we're the same religion. And he's got a Grossbart in his name. He's the Jew with the big beard. And finally, in the human stain, there is something in the name Coleman Silk that is symbolic. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. You're going to have to read the book. And the reason I'm not going to tell you is this is a great book in that every time I saw it described, it says things like, Coleman Silk has a secret, right? And he has a deep secret. And, oh, here it is, so Coleman Silk has a secret. And I thought, okay, there are no secrets left, right? Oh, he was molested, and they're having an incestuous affair, and he's gay. Like, I've seen all the secrets, right? So I rolled my eyes. Oh, he has a secret. Well, he has a secret, right? When you see it, it's shocking. And one of the nicest things about this book is you find out the secret in the second chapter. So you get to see it unfold through the rest of the book rather than it being this big reveal at the end. And the secret has to do with the name Coleman Silk, and that's all you're getting. And if you don't get it, when you write me after having read the book, then I'll tell you. But it's right there. Oh, and that's a great example. Nobody told me. As a matter of fact, I went to a class on the human stain in Israel, literature professor, and I raised my hand and I said, well, Coleman Silk. And she said, I never thought of that, right? So a lot of these symbols are not hard to reach, but it's not hard to get ones that other people might not see. Let's just talk a little bit about Philip Roth's life. He was born on March 19th, 1933 in Newark, New Jersey, in the Weequahic neighborhood. And lots of his fiction takes place in Newark and in Weequahic. His writing career is amazing. And here's a quote from a book dealer who made the interesting observation, tell me one other writer who 50 years apart writes masterpieces. His first book, Goodbye Columbus, to his last book, Nemesis, both of which are great. There's 51 years between them. That just doesn't happen. It didn't happen to Shakespeare. This is a remarkable career of great book after great book after great book. His career started with a book called Goodbye Columbus, which I've already mentioned has these short stories attached to them. And he got in some trouble with Goodbye Columbus because the description of Jews was not that flattering, especially in Defender of the Faith. And there was some explicit sex. There was premarital sex, and sex has followed Roth throughout his career, controversies over sex, mostly his fault. But he paints a suburban Jewish couple who's having premarital sex, and their attempt to get a diaphragm is an important part of the plot, and that was a big controversy about this book in 19... There was a rabbi who said, after Defender of the Jews came out, it originally was published in a literary magazine, who said, Jews in the Middle Ages would know what to do with this guy, right? And or worse. And there's a lot of controversy of people saying he's really embarrassing the Jewish community, and self-hating Jew is a nickname that has followed him throughout his career, and maybe later we'll talk a little bit about that if that's appropriate.
In terms of sex, in terms of whatever was offensive,
yes,
was that stuff that was shocking?
Yes, it was shocking to everybody, especially this book. All right, Portnoy's Complaint came out in the middle of the 60s generation, and it is told as Portnoy's Complaint. It's an extended monologue in a stream of consciousness between a Jew called Portnoy and his psychiatrist. And we get to hear all about his sexuality, a lot about masturbation. You're going to hear some of that later in today's talk, and about his desire for shiksas, Gentile women, and very explicit, very funny, and people were shocked and again appalled and attacked. And then, later in his career, he wrote some other things before then, but later in his career, he had a series of 4 incredibly remarkable books. And these 4 were published between 1995 and 2004. The New York Times Book Review solicited writers, critics, and editors and asked them, what's the single best work of American fiction published in the last 25 years? And they published the list of the top 22, based on what these top experts in fiction said. Here are the top 22. 6 of them were by Philip Roth. 4 of them are here.
Wow.
So very quickly, you know about The Plot Against America. Sabbath Theater is a filthy work about an aging Jewish puppeteer who is also a puppeteer with people, and especially with women. But it's as explicit as Portnoy's Complaint, except for it doesn't have the friendly, funny attitude. The American Pastoral is the one that he won the Pulitzer Prize for. It is about a Jew called the Swede, because he's always been able to flirt. He's blonde, he's athletic, and this is part of the American trilogy. His daughter gets caught up with a Weather Underground kind of anti-Vietnam War group, and all the tragedy that unfolds from that. I told you about the Humans thing and The Plot Against America. And then at the end of his career, he wrote what he calls the Nemesis books. And these are 4 rather short books. They might be 250 pages, but they're 250 pages with not many words on each page. They're a quick read, and particularly Indignation and Nemesis are very interesting, easy to read. Indignation is about a Jew who leaves the East Coast to go to a college in Ohio, and his awakening sexuality and his fight against the religious strictures of his college. And Nemesis, Roth's last book, is about polio comes to Newark and what it's like when the polio epidemic, which terrified an entire generation of Americans, where in this Jewish community, one by one, Jewish kids were getting sick and were dying. And it talks about how that manifests itself. Late Roth, it's very good, but it's all about dying and death. Every man and the humbling in particular. Although the humbling is also filthy. So he won many prizes. He won the National Book Award twice, the PEN-Faulkner Award 3 times, the Pulitzer Prize for American Pastoral, and the 2000, and he never won the Nobel Prize for Literature. But there was a period where every year, people were like, is he going to win this year? Is he going to win this year? Then one year, Bob Dylan won, and people were like, well, they're not going to give it to American Jews 2 years in a row. So it was sort of assumed that it was, they can't give it to someone who's dead. So, but every year, it was like, is he going to get this year? He never got it, but he did get the National Humanities Medal from President Obama in 2010.
Philip Roth. The 2010 National Humanities Medal to Philip Roth for his contributions to American letters. Mr. Roth is the author of 24 novels, including Portnoy's Complaint and American Pastoral, which won the 1998 Pulitzer Prize, and his criticism has appeared in our leading literary journals.
Yeah, isn't that nice? As I mentioned, much of late Roth is dedicated to issues of aging and death. He wrote a book called Patrimony, talking about his father's death. And in 2018, back in May 22nd, he passed away, and he insisted that he be buried with no Jewish ceremony. He was buried at a college, next to 2 Jewish friends, but with no Jewish traditions in the ceremony. We're going to talk about 3 themes in Roth. We're going to talk about Roth and women. We're going to talk about Roth and Jews. And we're going to talk about Roth and sex. So, Roth has often been accused of being misogynist. His women are drawn in a not so complimentary fashion. They're one of 3 things, pretty much. They are overbearing mothers, they are shrews, or they are unattainable shiksas. And one woman described him, one writer described him as saying, for Philip Roth, women are monstrous. In his life, his own behavior towards women was controversial. His second wife, Claire Bloom, who was an English actress, wrote a book about him, painting him as a manipulative, vicious person. He then wrote a book about her. Fictional. Everybody knew what was going on. Philip Roth on women. I'm going to read you, and this is the longest thing I'm going to read you, but it's great. The description of Portnoy's mother. It was my mother who could accomplish anything, who herself had to admit that it might even be that she was actually too good. And could a small child with my intelligence, with my powers of observation, doubt that this was so? She could make Jell-O, for instance, with sliced peaches hanging in it, peaches just suspended there in defiance of the law of gravity. She could bake a cake that tasted like a banana. Weeping, suffering, she grated her own horseradish rather than buy the pichos that they sold in a bottle at the delicatessen. She watched the butcher, as she put it, like a hawk, to be certain that he did not forget to put her chopped meat through the kosher grinder. She would telephone all the other women in the building drying clothes on back lines, even called the divorced goy on the top floor one magnanimous day to tell them, rush, take in the laundry. A drop of rain had fallen on our window pane. What radar on that woman? And this is before radar. the energy on her, the thoroughness, and this is this language. I'm a writer, and I love, just listen to this, okay? For mistakes, check my sums. For holes, my socks. For dirt, my nails and neck, every seam and crease of my body. She even dredges the furthest recesses of my ears by pouring cold peroxide into my head. It tingles and pops like an earful of ginger ale and brings to the surface in bits and pieces the hidden stores of yellow wax, which can apparently endanger a person's hearing. A medical procedure like this, crackpot though it may be, takes time, of course. It takes effort, to be sure. But where health and cleanliness are concerned, germs and bodily secretions, she will not spare herself and sacrifice others. She lights candles for the dead, others invariably forget. She religiously remembers, and without even the aid of a notation on the calendar. Devotion is just in her blood. She seems to be the only one, she says, who when she goes to the cemetery has the common sense, the ordinary common decency to clear the weeds from the graves of our relatives. The first bright day of spring, and she has moth-proofed everything wool in the house, rolled and bound the rugs, and dragged them off to my father's trophy room. She is never ashamed of her house. A stranger could walk in and open any closet, any drawer, and she would have nothing to be ashamed of. You could even eat off her bathroom floor if that should ever become necessary. When she loses at mahjong, she takes it like a sport. Not like the others whose names she could mention, but she won't even. Tilly Hoffman is too petty to even talk about. Let's just forget she even brought it up. She sews, she knits, she darns, she irons better even than the Schwarze, to whom, of all her friends, who each possess a piece of this grinning, childish black old lady's hide, she alone is good. I'm the only one who's good to her. I'm the only one who gives her a whole can of tuna for lunch, and I'm not talking dreck either. I'm talking chicken of the sea. Alex, I'm sorry, I can't be a stingy poison. Excuse me, but I can't live like that, even if it is 2 for $49. Esther Wasserberg leaves 25 cents in nickels around the house when Dorothy comes, and counts it up afterwards to see if it's all there. Maybe I'm too good, she whispers to me, meanwhile running scalding water over the dish from which the cleaning lady has just eaten her lunch, alone, like a leper. But I couldn't do a thing like that. Once Dorothy chanced to come back into the kitchen while my mother was still standing over the faucet marked H, sending torrents down upon the knife, and forget that it had just passed between the Schwarz's thick pink lips. Oh, you know how hard it is to get mayonnaise off silverware these days, Dorothy, says my nimble-tongued mother, and thus, she tells me later, by her quick thinking, has managed to spare the colored woman's feelings. So I have such a rich description. He does this all the time where he'll take a character and just walk it through. And here he uses the cadences of Eastern European Jewish immigrants to America to describe his mother from the perspective of him as a young man. Roth and Jews. I mentioned that he has been accused of being anti-Semitic, being self-hating. This is an interesting one. In the book Goodbye Columbus, his first, it's really a novella, it's not really a novel, there's a lot of Jewish excess where conspicuous consumption, one of the main conflicts is between the rich Jews, the Potemkins that Neil Klugman wants to spend time with, and Klugman who doesn't have money. And the movie with Richard Benjamin has a wedding scene that is famous. I'm just going to show you a little bit of it, and you'll see the excess.
You're next! I only get sick at weddings and bar mitzvahs. Come on, Kitty, let's dance.
Later, okay?
Later? From it? Later. Hey, Sonny, come on, take a picture. Just Molly and me. Why not? Just Molly. Take a picture. They're real nice. Ready? Ready? Smile.
Harry, what are you doing?
Harry. Thank you. Thank you.
You're next. By the way, sweetie, what have you been doing with yourself this summer? Growing a penis.
Now, depending on how you look at it, she has been growing a penis. She's been growing clubman's penis. So, which at the time, you know, premarital sex was really, really considered a terrible thing in a lot of Jewish circles, and you see in the novella that her parents really flip out when they find out. So I want to talk to you about the Swede a little bit. I mentioned him as the character from American Pastoral. Go ahead and turn to excerpt B. I'm going to read to you how he describes this one very alienated character from American Pastoral, talking about Sunday school and synagogue. But I was never interested in that stuff, Donnie. Back for as long as I can remember, I never understood it. Does anybody? I don't know what they're talking about. I go to these synagogues and it's all foreign to me. It always has been. When I had to go to Hebrew school as a kid, all the time I was in that room, I couldn't wait to get out on the ball field. I used to think, if I sit in this room any longer, I'm going to get sick. There was something unhealthy about these places. Anywhere near any of those places, I knew it wasn't where I wanted to be. The factory was a place I wanted to be from the time I was a boy. The ball field was a place I wanted to be from the time I started kindergarten. That this is a place where I want to be, I knew the moment I laid eyes on it. Why shouldn't I be where I want to be? Why shouldn't I be with who I want to be? Isn't that what this country is all about? I want to be where I want to be, and I don't want to be where I don't want to be. That's what being an American is, isn't it? Now, we don't have time right now to go over these 4 questions, but you might take a look later. The most interesting chunk of this to me is he makes 5 questions. He's not making statements. He's asking questions and he's making them to his Gentile girlfriend. So that just shows you Roth really interrogating Jewish identity in post-war American life and why and how people try to flee from their Jewishness but maybe can't really get away from it. And that's really the last third of American Pastoral. That's the theme. Roth himself was an atheist. He once said, "I'm exactly the opposite of religious. I'm anti-religious. I find religious people hideous. I hate the religious lies. It's all a big lie." Roth on sex. I'd say the most famous scene in Portnoy's Complaint. Does anybody know? Yes.
You want the famous scene?
The most famous scene.
The one with the family's dinner.
Yes, there you go. Okay, good, thank you. So this is before that part, but you're thinking the right thing. Okay, so this is from a section called Whacking Off, and it's all caps, Whacking Off, and he talks about masturbation to his psychiatrist. On an outing of our family association, I once cored an apple, saw to my astonishment, and with the aid of my obsession, what it looked like, and ran off into the woods to fall upon the orifice of the fruit, pretending that the cool and mealy hole was actually between the legs of that mythical being who always called me Big Boy, when she pleaded for what no girl in all recorded history had ever had. "Oh, shove it in me, Big Boy," cried the cored apple that I banged silly on that picnic. "Big Boy, oh give me everything you've got," begged the empty milk bottle that I kept hidden in our storage bin in the basement, to drive wild after school with my Vaseline upright. "Come, Big Boy, come," screamed the maddened piece of liver that, in my own insanity, I'd bought one afternoon at a butcher shop and, believe it or not, violated behind a billboard on the way to a bar mitzvah wedding. Now, later he does that again, but to his horror, his mother sees the liver and cooks it and serves it for dinner. Which is what you were referring to. I'm going to read a filthier bit and then describe an even filthier bit. So bear with me, I picked short ones, but I want you to hear both how filthy he gets and how well he writes it. So, this is from Sabbath Theater. It's a lesbian scene. Her knowledge of the female body, how to caress it, how to kiss it, how to touch my skin and make my nipples hard, and to suck my nipples, and that loving, giving, very sensual way, very like a man, that kind of erotic vibration that she would deliver to me, made me so very hot. So I want to talk to you about a couple of things about that bit. First of all, there aren't any dirty words. Nipples is about the dirtiest, right? So he doesn't have to cheat by giving us dirty words. Second, it's got a driving, rhythmic, sexual pattern. Very like a man, that kind of erotic vibration she would deliver to make me so very hot. Also in Sabbath Theater, there is a very long bit that is a transcript of basically a phone sex call he has with one of his students that got him kicked out as a professor. And for pages and pages, you have the text of Sabbath Theater on the top, and just like Rashi, along the bottom you have the transcript of this dirty conversation. And I'm not going to read you that, but it's like this times 5. One of the questions is, are his works pornographic? And you might imagine, think the answer is no. One of the definitions of obscenity says that it's not obscene if it has literary or cultural merit. And I think the fact that Roth has literary merit is just not debatable. It certainly was, especially at a time when you didn't have the internet, you didn't have easy access to pornography. There was a lot of prurient interest that people had in some of what he was writing, but it was always at a literary level. So I certainly, and I think the debate over whether his works are pornographic is a debate of 30 or 40 years ago. It doesn't seem to be going on today. Another thing I'd like to talk to you about is Roth on Roth. One of the wonderful things about Philip Roth is he's not shy about talking about himself and about his works, and he's not afraid to do readings of his works. He shares his perspectives. There are a lot of writers who are reclusive or who are arrogant about what they write, and they try to make the interviewer look stupid, or that they disdain the reader. And he's playful sometimes, but ultimately he just comes out and talks about his own thoughts about being a writer and his own thoughts about the things that he writes. And I just want to show you a little bit of an interview we did on PBS.
I don't think about the reader. I think about the book. I think about the sentence. I think about the paragraph. I think about the page. I go over it and over it and over it. The book begins to make its demands. The demands are intellectual, they're imaginative, they're aesthetic. I'm a very bad judge of how people will respond to my work, how the general reader will respond to a book. And I'm always surprised by the responses that a book elicits.
Many observers have noted this great run of books that you've had over the last, say, 10 years or so. What happened?
What did I eat for breakfast, you mean? I don't know. Maybe it's a consequence of age. But I did feel energetic, and I did feel ambitious, and I did the work.
See what I mean? He engages, and it's really interesting, and to me it helps understand the things that he wrote. And here's just a bit, very short, of his reading from his last book.
From Nemesis. And yet, at 23, he was, to all of us boys, the most exemplary and revered authority we knew. A young man of convictions, easygoing, kind, fair-minded, thoughtful, stable, gentle, soft-spoken, vigorous, muscular, a comrade and leader both. And never a more glorious figure than on the afternoon near the end of June, before the '44 epidemic seriously took hold in the city, before, for more than a few of us, our bodies and our lives would be drastically transformed, when we all marched behind him to the big dirt field across the street and down a short slope from the playground. It was where the high school football team held its workouts and practices, and where he was going to show us how to throw the javelin.
I have picked my favorite 10 lines from Philip Roth. Some of these are famous lines. For example, "Old age isn't a battle, old age is a massacre," is a well-known quote from Roth about aging. Some of these I Googled and nobody uses, or they're pretty unusual. Not until there is baseball in Israel will Messiah come. I love that quote. I love that quote because he is an American Jewish writer. And here he's taking baseball, sticking it in Israel, and saying that the world will never be complete until this piece, this very important piece of American Jewish identity, right? A lot of American Jews, particularly in the 50s, thinking about Sandy Koufax and Hank Greenberg, was very important to them. It was a way of saying, we are American. Until that comes to Israel, the world can't be complete and the Messiah can't come. Another one I love is, Jews are to history what Eskimos are to snow. Just really delicious. We won't have a lot of time to look at this, but you can enjoy that. I've prepared questions for you to look at, some extended quotes that I've made from some of his works, so that you'll be able to see some of the best of what he's done. Let me just read to you from A. "I took a seat in the last row, which was empty. 2 rows in front of me sat Grossbart, Fishbein, and Halpern, holding little white Dixie cups. Each row of seats was raised higher than the one in front of it, and I could see clearly what was going on. Fishbein was pouring the contents of his cup into Grossbart's, and Grossbart looked mirthful as the liquid made a purple arc between Fishbein's hand and his. In the glaring yellow light, I saw the chaplain standing on the platform at the front. He was chanting the first line of the responsive reading. Grossbart's prayer book remained closed on his lap. He was swishing the cup around. Only Halpern responded to the chant by praying. The fingers of his right hand were spread wide across the cover of his open book. His cap was pulled low onto his brow, which made it round like a yarmulke. From time to time, Grossbart wet his lips at the cup's edge. Fishbein, his long yellow face like a dying light bulb." All right, so I'm going to stop here, but I want to just tell you that if you think about it, if you look at this text, I hope you will. I've given you a tiny URL for it, or you can look at it here with some questions. These 3 Jews, these 3 privates, they are wearing uniforms, which is supposed to make them uniforms, but they represent 3 types of American Jews. So if you think about it, try to think about what each American Jew is based on what they do with their hats, with their wine, and this is a very short bit, and it's just filled with symbolism and meaning for American Jews, and he was 26 years old. To sum up, I just wanted everybody to know that this evening I'm doing a session on when Jewish opinion gets at your kishkas. We're going to talk about Michael Shabone's speech, where he said it doesn't really matter, Jewish continuity, just be a good person. And a lot of people are upset about that. We're going to look at other texts that might make you mad, that say good Jews must live in Israel, that say circumcision is wrong, and other ideas that may get at your kishkas and we'll talk about how to respond to them. I also know that this has been LImmud Europe. I don't know if any of you are from other countries in the region. I have a budget to travel to LIMUDs and to scholar residencies. So if anybody does want me to come to their LIMUD, you don't have to fly me in. And I have a variety of sessions, including these. I teach Jewish Broadway, Holocaust poetry. I would sure like to come to your event. And the last thing is anybody, and I mean this, you got to read it, you got to write to me about what you thought about it. But anybody who would like a copy of The Plot Against America or the UN Stain can come up and say hello at the end of the session. And thank you for participating. I really enjoyed talking to you.
I have one question.
Sure.
I could never figure out how come that Philip Roth never received the Nobel Prize.
I know. Well,
So, have you an explanation for that?
it's very frustrating.
Yes.
But there are a lot of people who resent him because of his attitude towards women. You have to get a lot of votes, right? There are other prizes he's won where there's a woman who resigned from the committee because he got the prize and she was offended. So, you know, there is, of course, attitudes towards Jews, there's attitudes towards Americans. He was up against a lot. In a vote, you have to win. You have to win by beating out a lot of other candidates.
But his literary supremacy is so
I agree.
outstanding.
It's offensive.
But how does he feel about it, not having a vote in it?
Well, he was sad. He would talk about how he really would like to have won the Nobel Prize.